Carissa Patrone Maikuri is a program coordinator with Drawdown Lift, the newest program of Project Drawdown that works to deepen collective understanding of the links between climate change solutions and poverty alleviation, particularly in Africa and South Asia. She has over 10 years of experience in community-driven development, sustainability, equity, and climate change. She earned a Master of Public Administration degree with an emphasis in nonprofit management and leadership from Grand Valley State University and holds a certificate in climate change and health from the Yale School of Public Health. In her spare time, she can be found running around one of the Great Lakes or in the Twin Cities or reading a good book outside. So please join me in welcoming Carissa Patrone Maikuri.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for that introduction, Jason. You all are welcome to, I'll try to monitor the chat as best as I can so that I could maybe answer some of your questions in real time. But if not, I can answer those after I give this brief presentation. So thank you again for inviting me to be here. Fun fact is that I also went through the Climate Reality Leadership Training Program in Minneapolis in 2019 before moving to the Twin Cities from Michigan last year. I'm Carissa, as Jason said. I work with Project Drawdown as the program coordinator with Drawdown Lift. And today I'm privileged to be here with you all to share about how climate solutions can contribute to not only improving human well-being, but alleviating poverty as well, particularly in rural communities in Africa and South Asia. So if you wouldn't mind sharing those slides, Jason, I'd like to start out with a small poll on the second slide. And you can drop your answers into the chat. So what percentage of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions, so that would be from the industrial age to 2020, have come from Africa? I'll give you a second to drop in your answer into the chat. Well, they're all A's apparently, but 1%, 3%, 10%, or 15%. So it looks like most of you have answered 3%, and you are correct. So cumulatively, the continent of Africa has only emitted less than 4% of emissions globally, whereas the US, for example, has contributed to around 29% of cumulative CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know, what is drawdown? So drawdown really refers to the future point in time when emissions start to level off and then steadily decline. So drawdown would really be a milestone in reversing climate change and then reducing global average temperatures as well. So Project Drawdown really works to support the world in reaching drawdown as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. So we are a small US 100% remote based team, and we are known most for the best-selling book Drawdown, which was published a few years back, which was then updated in 2020 with the Drawdown Review, which is available on our website for free. So we're a leading resource for climate solutions and strategies, particularly when a lot of the climate rhetoric has been around kind of doom and gloom, which of course, like there's a lot of harm being done and there's a lot more that can be done, collectively to draw down greenhouse gas emissions, but we're really focused on solutions and strategies for change. So there are several qualities of Project Drawdown solutions. So we've identified 93 solutions. And in June, we added another 11 to the mix, which were focused on ocean-based solutions in particular. So from reducing food waste to clean energy, all the solutions in our system or suite of solutions are all interconnected, and we need all of them enabled in order to reach drawdown. So Project Drawdown solutions are currently available, financially viable, have proven potential to reduce greenhouse gases, and sufficient data to model how much of those greenhouse gases can be either mitigated, reduced, or sequestered. So as most of the greenhouse gases are broken down into where they're emitted per sector. For example, the bulk of our greenhouse gas sources are in the electricity production piece of this puzzle, food, agriculture, and land use and industry, and then transportation and buildings follow after that. So these sectors are responsible for around 90% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and drawdown solutions are focused on all of these sectors. So as you all are very much so aware, climate change touches all aspects of our lives, from health of ourselves and our people to the health of our planet. So Drawdown's framework really recognizes that major systemic change in all areas is required in order to reach drawdown. So in climate action, we can start by reducing the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, specifically in high emitting countries like the US and European countries. And then through that, we can focus on shifting to renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency, and reducing food waste and loss, and shifting diets. So the second part of the framework really looks at natural carbon sinks. So enhancing these sinks to then remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, for example, through sustainable agricultural practices or protecting and restoring ecosystems, both land-based and sea-based. And then last but not least, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that we have a solution that's now kind of changed to be family planning and education instead of just health and education, to better kind of understand what that solution is all about, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we really focus on addressing systemic inequities in society to achieve broader transformations for people. So taken together, reducing sources, improving sinks, and really addressing inequities in society have to be pursued not only on an individual level, because we all have individual actions that we can take, but also at a global level as well. So the focus of Drawdown Lift, as I had mentioned before, is really kind of at that intersection between climate solutions, human well-being, and poverty alleviation. So we know that climate change and poverty are inextricably linked. People who are experiencing extreme poverty, and particularly women and children, are the most vulnerable to natural disasters and commonly live in regions that are most impacted by climate change and will be continuously most impacted by climate change. And while the Drawdown Lift program focuses on Africa and South Asia, a lot of the themes around deep systemic inequities can also be applied to communities in the US today as well. So our work at Drawdown Lift really also exemplified in our climate poverty report, which I'll touch on a little bit later, works to deepen the collective understanding between all of those linkages: climate, poverty, and human well-being. So all the solutions that we had analyzed, through Project Drawdown's research are climate mitigation focused, or focused on reducing emissions. These subset of solutions that we focus on, there are 28 of them that Drawdown Lift focuses on specifically, are proven to not only mitigate greenhouse gases, but also have benefits for climate adaptation as well as resilience. Next slide, please. So kind of moving on to vulnerability and disproportionate impact, you can see that on the x-axis, you can see vulnerability. So as vulnerability increases, you can also see the correlation with people who are living in extreme poverty to be able to respond to climate change and build capacity to be able to prepare better for climate change and natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change as well. So we have to recognize that the impacts of climate change really dramatically vary across countries and social groups within those countries, particularly due to systems of oppression, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy that And we recognize that rural communities in Africa and South Asia are often first and worst impacted by climate change, yet have contributed the least to the problem historically. So women, people who are experiencing poverty, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities are often those who are socially disadvantaged and left out of crucial resources that could help them be better able to adapt and prepare for climate change. But they're not only excluded from, social systems and economic and educational systems, but access to vital resources as well. So just as people who are, experiencing extreme poverty do so in gender specific ways, the adverse effects of climate change are also strongly gendered due to that lack of access of vital resources and decision-making power, for example. So for example, climate-driven hazards disproportionately harm women and exacerbate gender disparities in education, reproductive health, and socioeconomic status. And in order to really have a world where we can advance climate change solutions together, women must be able to fully participate in all spheres of life, including in climate negotiations and, the advocacy for, human rights, climate goals, and a more responsive, accountable leadership in governments as well. And then last but not least, children are also disproportionately impacted by climate change. It has said that babies born in 2020 in sub-Saharan Africa are projected to experience six times more extreme climate events over their lifetimes than their counterparts who were born in 1960. So we continuously see how systems of oppression have really exacerbated the impacts on communities who are already facing multiple, barriers to being able to live a full and healthy life. And this is something that, it's important to learn about, but also advocate for, is the change in systems and really prioritizing, kind of changing the narrative to really be able to better support and protect people who are most harmed by climate change. So as I had mentioned before, Drawdown Lift has identified a subset of 28 different climate solutions that generate co-benefits or human well-being benefits for people. So those are all shown in the colored bubbles here, whereas the rest of the Project Drawdown solutions are in the gray bubbles. And it's not to say that the other solutions don't necessarily have benefits for human well-being, but these are the solutions that are prioritized for specifically rural communities and under-resourced communities in Africa and South Asia. So for example, in improving agriculture and agroforestry, reduced food waste, silvopasture, multi-strata agroforestry, and tree intercropping have been grouped together because of the human well-being benefits that are similar across all of those solutions. So you can see that there are 5 different groups of solutions that are shown here. So in order to assess the evidence of all these 5 different solution groups, we looked at 12 dimensions of human well-being that are based on the donut economics framework that really looks at, an economic model that is more inclusive, but also, focuses on gender equality within that framework. And we also use it because of its adaptability and flexibility. So we evaluated the evidence for those 5 different climate groups, solution groups, on the 12 different dimensions of human well-being. And we reviewed over 450 peer-reviewed articles and reports and talked to many different stakeholders to be able to put this climate poverty report together. And this is a figure that kind of shows the highlights and high level just takeaway points in focused on the 28 solutions that we've identified in the report. So on the left side of the figure, it shows the 5 different solution groups. And then in the second column shows the amount of greenhouse or emission reduction potential of the specific solution groups. And then on the right-hand side of the figure, using the gray and teal icons, you can see which of the human well-being benefits can be generated from those specific climate solutions in those groups. So, for example, fostering equality, the health and education solution, addresses all 12 of the human well-being benefits that we have identified. And that's the only solution group that does so in a very direct way. And there are other human well-being benefits that are more indirect, that stem through whether it's food or income and work. And I'll show you a few different figures to come as well. But today I'll take you through like a little bit of a deeper dive into improving agriculture, the first one, and then fostering equality, which is the last one on the list as well. So changing the way that we grow food is super critical to addressing climate change and also addressing hunger across the world. Our analysis suggests that improving agriculture has an emission reduction potential of about 9 gigatons per year. And to put this into context, the total annual global greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 was approximately 50. So it's really crucial, especially in Africa and South Asia, to focus on these specific sectors. So improving agricultural productivity is a key pathway to eliminating poverty and hunger, because in 2020, for example, more than 2.3 billion people, or a third of the world's population, experienced moderate or severe food insecurity. And globally, food insecurity among women is about 10% higher than that of men. And we've seen how globally connected we are with the war in Ukraine, for example, and the recent heat waves throughout the world, how that has completely exacerbated food insecurity in many countries that are dependent, for example, on wheat and fertilizer from Ukraine. So it's just one example of how, what we do where we are really matters, and what the collective, global movement does is also just as crucial. One last statistic that I wanted to share with you is that in Africa, for example, 21% of the population experiences undernourishment, while in Asia, around 9% of the population is undernourished. And World Bank economists estimate that improvements in agriculture are 11 more times effective in reducing extreme poverty than investments in other sectors. So that's just one thing to note that is of importance. So this system diagram does a little bit of a deeper dive into the well-being benefits that stem from these agriculture and agroforestry solutions. So kind of similar to the other figure, the human well-being benefits are on the right, and then the system of solutions is on the left. The direct benefits are shown in those dark gray lines, and then the smaller kind of dotted lines show those indirect benefits to human well-being. So that goes to show that there are some human well-being benefits that then enable other co-benefits kind of later on. And agriculture and agroforestry related climate solutions have both direct co-benefits around income and work, water and sanitation, and food. And some of the indirect benefits are networks, education, energy, housing, health, and gender equality. So for example, systems like intensification for smallholders or agroforestry can thus boost food security and increase income, which provides a buffer against climate events, which can also, an increase in household income can be used to purchase cleaner energy or a mobile phone that can help to further reduce food waste or improving access to better markets. And then that food security and increase in income can then better contribute to improved health and gender equality, which can then, address some improvements in social equity and peace and justice, which are more longer term benefits for people in communities. One important thing to note, especially when it comes to these agriculture and agroforestry solutions, is that women's and Indigenous peoples' secure land tenure is crucial. For example, 85% of women lack the right to own land, but even though women farmers make up around 40% of the agricultural labor force in low and middle income countries. Achieving co-benefits of land ownership is really linked to land tenure. So secure land tenure can increase the probability that farmers will adopt sustainable land use practices, which will have better ecological outcomes as well as improved food security. So there's also evidence that women's secure land tenure can lead to all of the points shown here: more household income, increased income and agency, reduced gender-based violence, as well as a higher adoption of conservation practices as well. So women have to be a part of the conversation and need to be the leaders that they're meant to be as well. So kind of switching gears here and moving on to the fostering equality solution, which is, that's kind of like the name of the sector, but the solution itself is family planning and education. It includes voluntary rights-based family planning and universal education. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, around 30% or around 100 million children and adolescents do not attend primary or secondary school, whereas in South Asia, around 20% of children don't attend school. And those numbers were definitely exacerbated throughout and after, the height of COVID and to today. But 3/4 of children who never attend primary school are girls from rural and under-resourced communities. And kind of on the other half of the solution is talking about family planning. So around 218 million women of reproductive age want to avoid becoming pregnant, but don't have access to a modern method of contraception. And for example, in all of the climate modeling, population is always a factor when it comes to modeling for climate change and impacts on a global level. So that's just an important thing to note, but just to be clear that family planning and ensuring that everyone's contraceptive needs are met in a way that centers bodily autonomy and human rights in itself is not a mitigation solution, which I think is something that is kind of misconstrued sometimes, but rather it's the outcome of family planning, which is slower population growth over time that would show a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And this is not, solely an issue of people living in Africa and South Asia, but access to universal health care and specifically family planning and contraception is an issue in a lot of parts of the world in many communities. So this is the systems diagram for the fostering equality group of solutions. And you can also see here that there are no cascading benefits on the far right side. They're all either direct co-benefits or indirect benefits. And this is the only group of solutions that has only direct and indirect out of all the 5 that we've analyzed in the group of 28 climate solutions. So again, you can see that in the thick gray lines, those lead to those direct co-benefits, and then the indirect co-benefits are the ones that follow, such as networks, housing, energy, peace, and justice. Project Drawdown's health and education solution really focuses on that rights-based voluntary family planning and high-quality inclusive education. And for example, households in which no girls or women has completed at least 6 years of school make up to 2/3 of those people experiencing multidimensional poverty globally. So education is crucial, not only for, the empowerment of women and to advance, basic rights among boys and girls. It's important that we see that the benefits of the 12 dimensions of human well-being here in the blue rectangles are very strong, more so than the other 5 groups of the solutions. So health and education is really crucial. And I think that that's something that will be focused on moving forward, not only, education in general terms, but education around climate change as well. So to start to conclude this presentation, our thorough review really provided solid and substantial evidence that these 28 climate solutions that I had mentioned generate significant benefits for human well-being, particularly around income and work, health, food security, education, gender equality, and energy, that are transformational and also crucial to help to alleviate poverty and increase resilience to not only today's climate impacts, but future impacts as well. And together they have an emission reduction potential of around 690 gigatons between 2020 and 2050 if all of these 5 solution groups are implemented. So improving the well-being of people experiencing extreme poverty and addressing climate change can and must be complementary, and they can contribute to a low carbon pathway to prosperity for all people. So we're really eager to raise awareness and spread knowledge around this report, the Climate Poverty Connections report, which I will drop a link in the chat to you all. Particularly for decision makers and policymakers in Africa and South Asia, but everyone has a role to play in advancing this work and advancing, knowledge around the intersections that I've kind of laid out for you. But here, in the US, as a high emitting country, we have individual actions that we need to take, and we also have collective actions that we need to take to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But on a global level, we really need to be able to prioritize, especially with COP27 coming up in less than 30 days, prioritizing and supporting communities who have historically been harmed most by climate change and will continue to do so if people in high income countries continue to operate kind of as business as usual. So I know that was a lot of information, but I thank you all so much for your time, and I will share a link to, it's a link tree, so it has a ton of different links kind of in it, along with the climate poverty report and a 2-page fact sheet that accompanies that in English and French. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have as well. But before I do so, I will copy this link into the chat.
All right. I think Lincoln, you had a question?
Yeah, so how are the various conflicts around the world taken into account when calculating the amount of drawdown for any given sector? That's a really interesting question. And I think it's important to note that, war and conflict definitely does play a huge role in greenhouse gas emissions, and that fluctuates over time depending on, what's going on a global level. So we, in our modeling, analyze either the, emissions reduction potential or the avoided emissions. So for example, this is not necessarily related to conflict, but just to kind of set the tone for how we kind of do our modeling. So for example, communities in Africa, around 100 million people still lack access to electricity. So in regards to that, electricity sector and energy production, we consider those who have electricity who are high emitting countries and those who lack access to electricity, who should have electricity as a basic human need, so that we are measuring, if, in the next 30 years, people in Africa continuously gain access to electricity, what that would be in avoided emissions. For example, whether they were implemented, with solar or hydro or geothermal on the flip side, instead of coal, for example. So the modeling is, based on data points at a specific given time, but isn't necessarily like a living model where, okay, like because we're in, conflict in, the Horn of Africa, or, in Europe, for example, those numbers in greenhouse gases don't necessarily reflect that in the model to date. We are hiring now a new science team who will do a deeper dive, because now our modeling is at a global scale, to kind of draw down to a regional level to see which climate solution should be implemented where, when. So which climate solutions we have to kind of utilize as an emergency brake to reduce the most vast amount of emissions as possible first, and then figure out from there, what are strategically where these solutions can be implemented to address specific greenhouse gas emissions in each region. So I'm not sure if that's kind of a roundabout way of answering.
Well, I think it's really hard to do that, but right. I also think that the impact of conflicts, both in terms of generating more greenhouse gases, as well as disrupting any potential progress in implementing those solutions, is probably a pretty significant impact. And I'm wondering if your scientists try to calculate at least the amount of greenhouse gases that come out of these god-awful conflicts.
Yeah, I think there are studies that have been done. I would have to do some digging, but that's not something that we are currently looking into when it comes to conflict right now. Our system of solutions is kind of like a suite of solutions asking the question, is it possible with all the climate solutions that we have at hand to date to address climate change and start drawing down emissions? And is it financially viable? And what are the technologies that are available today? There's a lot of conversations around carbon capture and funding those types of technologies, but those, if and when they're implemented, the technology isn't there to be able to do so at scale right now. So that would have to be kind of at the tail end of like, we've implemented all these other solutions, like that's kind of a last resort solution to implement. So we're looking at really which solutions we need to implement first, where, and how. And there's obviously a ton of barriers even in implementing a solution in a specific community here and abroad. So there's a lot of nuance that goes on. We have the data from the modeling, but what does that mean in actually implementation, in communities and countries, especially those who are under-resourced and underfunded.
Okay. We have a question from, I think Tim is next, and then Hobie's got a question. So Tim, if you want to go ahead there.
Sure. Carissa, I'm wondering if these solutions have been communicated to these African and South Asian nations, and if so, what their reaction is and how likely it is that they're going to follow them and so forth.
Yeah, so we are currently working to be more connected with policymakers in South Africa, like sub-Saharan Africa and South Asian communities. Our program is only about 1.5 years old, so a lot of our work done to date has been to pull together and synthesize a lot of this information, engage with key stakeholders and partners, and now we're kind of in this dissemination phase of the report and really being able to connect with leaders who are ministries of agriculture and ministers of health, and that's part of what we're, our mission is, and going to COP this year as, our first time going as a small team, but also, we've had a lot of great feedback from, large development banks and climate finance institutions. And it's really, working at addressing both climate and poverty together on all fronts. So funding structures, in implementation, and on like community-based action as well. And we're kind of I would say in the beginning phases of still, socializing the report and getting the report out there. But we have had a lot of positive interactions with folks. But, continuous conversations are needed to be had. And, we need to figure out how we can really leverage more funding so that these climate solutions would be easier to implement in specific contexts as well.
All right. Hope you want to go ahead there.
Thanks, Carissa. Fascinating, and I'm glad my colleagues brought up not just the war, because that's where my head went. It was migration, water. I think about 2 million people in the Horn of Africa. And I think I picked a hard thing to work on, climate change in the US. I don't know how you keep your hope up, but that's great. I was wondering, as long as your drawdown delegation is going to Egypt, are you going to protest the political prisoners and imprisonment while you're there in Egypt?
That's an interesting question. I think because we have just figured out just last week that we're able to go, I think I haven't really like wrapped around my head that like, okay, we're going and we're planning for this. We've submitted a few events to different pavilions, and we were accepted to present at the locally led adaptation pavilion, and we've gathered a few different speakers, and we by no means want to be, the face of any of these conversations, being a US based led organization, but really we want to be able to provide knowledge and be a knowledge partner for specific communities most impacted by climate change, to really leverage this report as a resource to be able to better advocate for loss and damage, for example. And to address your question specifically, I don't have a good answer for you for that, but I'm interested in learning.
Yeah, I'd like you to consider it when
Yeah.
you talk about equity and inequality and barriers to doing certain things. Certainly, the freedom to actually, it also applies to gender equity as well. The ability to state what you're for and what you want and what you want to achieve is an important part of the climate solutions as that. And so it's just the irony of being an oppressive country that holds 2,000 political prisoners, some of whom are climate activists, amongst others, would be a question I'd have your organization at least take a look at.
Right. Yeah, I have done a lot of reading about it, and I think that it's definitely a dichotomy being, named as like the African COP, which it's a great thing that it's hosted on the continent of Africa, but there are a lot of layers of oppression that go on in, around environmental and climate organizing and having your voice heard, and even just, disappearances of environmental and climate justice warriors, specifically in Central American countries and South American countries. So that's definitely a huge issue, and I welcome that conversation. And I think that's something that I'll have to take some more time and reflect on how maybe we can put together.
Naomi Klein has a good article. I think it's in the New York Times if you've read that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I think, Brick, you have a question.
I do. Thank you, Carissa. That was a wonderful presentation. Lots of fascinating and interesting graphics that I think each one would take a little bit more in depth to like really work through the details of them. There's a lot of content on each one of those. So my question is on one of those slides, and it was the chart that you had where you had the relationship between risk and vulnerability and risks relative to the proportion of those in poverty, I believe. And Jason, I don't know if you could skim back to that slide if possible, if you could find it. Anyways, I was interested, it was comparing the two populations, South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, I believe. And I thought it was a much steeper slope. I expected a more gradual slope in the plot of all the dots. I don't understand. I don't have a full understanding of all the data that's behind it because I know you don't have the time to really go into it. But so my one question is, for South Asia, would the vulnerability and risks really be more related to the flooding elements, and sub-Saharan Africa would be drought? Do you think that's the greatest risks respective to each of those populations?
Yeah, so the modeling that we had pulled from to create that figure, Jason, I'm not sure which slide it was, but I think it was before the figure that you were showing before.
Yeah.
But on the x-axis, it's vulnerability and readiness, and that is pulled from the
Readiness,
ND,
right.
which I will pull up and send to you right now. But the ND gain looks into a lot of different aspects when it comes to vulnerability. And so I'm not sure if you all can see, but the darker blue dots are South Asian countries, and then the kind of teal-ish green dots are sub-Saharan African countries. And you can see that, you know, there's a higher vulnerability and a low amount of readiness to the right-hand side of the graph. And then that correlates with increase in extreme levels of poverty as well. Here, I just pulled up so this is a really fascinating resource. It's kind of like a scorecard, and when it comes to climate vulnerability, and it ranks countries on their vulnerability and readiness to address and adapt to climate change, which pulls from a lot of different data. It does consider climate impacts, but it goes beyond that.
I expected it to have a more gradual slope, not having thought about it until you presented it, but it's such a steep slope. Seemed a bit surprising to me. I would have expected a little bit more gradual slope, and I'm wondering if you know anything more about the data that's behind this, of what might explain why there's, I guess, a less of a variability between the low vulnerability and the high vulnerability in this chart.
Yeah.
And what might explain that?
So it does definitely correlate with climate-related disasters, and then the need to be able to adapt to disasters as well, but also
part of me wonders, again, not really having put much thought into it, that there might be, you know, the scale of the percent or proportion of those that are part of the poverty component is just much different than what you would expect, what we observe or know that occur in more Western societies and other countries, where there's more access to credit and other resources.
right.
That might be partly explaining it too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways,
Yeah,
it was an interesting graphic, and
yeah, there are a lot of different factors that go into that. So the framework that we use to really be able to assess the climate solutions and their human well-being benefits. So I had mentioned before, we had adopted the donut economics framework that has 12 different kind of segments of human well-being, and we have 31 different indicators within that that kind of go into detail of specific, items that we're looking at when it comes to then not necessarily providing a score for a country, because we're not judging by any means, but seeing where the greatest need is in regards to human well-being. So taking into consideration all of those 12 different sectors, one being housing, one being energy, one being gender equality, social equity, peace and justice, etc. And in mapping those, which Jason, I think I added those maps like at the end, if you wanted to show one of them, like at the very end, I think after the thank you slide, yeah, that one. It shows that those are kind of our key focus areas, the ones that are in red in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And that was just, to make sure that we're continuously prioritizing those communities that are most impacted, but also, there is the greatest need in regards to all of those sectors.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Well, I want to thank Carissa for a fantastic presentation and also a great Q&A. That's very rich and robust there. So there's a lot of information to take away. So for further information, be sure to check out drawdown.org. We'll also have links available on our website as well. Coming up next month, we will have Lee Freilich, Director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology, discussing the Green Again Madagascar project, a tropical rainforest restoration project associated with the University of Minnesota. So be sure to join us for that, as well as further details on our upcoming chapter elections for next year. And with that, on behalf of the leadership team here at the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project, thanks for attending.